Here we are with this late model JK LT 5.3. Sorry about the drone footage, guys. Just did an update on the drone and it's acting all erratic. But this Jeep's got a lot of stuff, as you can tell. I think it's a 3-link, anti-rock. I don't think he has 1-tons, speed bumps. Heavy Jeep, but this 5.3 pulls it just fine. Let's take a quick look under the hood. All right, so it looks like they put the LT2 intake on it, which you can. We did put the Motec battery tray. It's got PSC. I don't, you know, originally when we got this, the intake was over on this side, on the driver's side, which kind of made no sense. They moved everything over there, but it looks a little more standard. It doesn't look the same as ours, but everything's working good, and that's what matters. This morning we are in a late model JK with a 5.3 LT 8-speed, and we haven't done an 8-speed in a little while, but we actually didn't do this Jeep. Well, we kind of did. Let me explain. This Jeep was built by another shop. I think it was local in Vegas. They installed an LT 5.3 and an 8-speed, and let's just say the customer wasn't happy. There was a host of issues, a lot of issues. The cruise control didn't work, the tap shift didn't work, the firewall was bashed in and it broke the seam open in the tunnel, so he had hot gases coming in and a lot of noise. The engine didn't run right. Even this mile per gallon display here didn't have the inputs, so it was just dashes because it had maxed out. There were body bolts missing. One of the biggest issues he had was this shop tried to do a single module, so they eliminated the Jeep computer. And the Jeep computer is part of the security system, the SCIM system, the secret key system. And there's a secret code that transmits between the WCM, the TCM, and the powertrain control module, or in this case, the engine control module. So with the engine control module out of circuit, the proper codes were not being sent, and the vehicle wouldn't start. So he had to keep the computer in the back seat and get out and plug it in when the vehicle wouldn't start. And even when it did start, it just ran kind of crappy. So there was just a ton of issues. When we took the body off this vehicle, we found even more issues. Body bolts were missing, holes in the exhaust all over the place. Now this vehicle was running an 8-speed with a T87A, which would indicate it's a 17 and up powertrain. But the engine was a old 4-wire rail pressure sensor engine, which indicates it's a 14, 15, or 16. So the two technically are not compatible. Will they run together? Yeah, but it's not ideal, and it wasn't ideal. It didn't run right. So we had to update the engine from the old 4-wire pressure sensor to the 3-wire pressure sensor. And you say, well, there's one less wire. Does it give you less information? And the reality is, no, it gives you more, because we're going from a basically discrete sensor that had a couple of signals to a serial communication sensor. So I think it can transmit 4 or 5 signals over the 3 wires. So we basically took it apart and put it back together the way it's supposed to be. You guys hear me yakking all the time about it's harder to do a conversion on something that's already had a conversion than if it was just clean. Because at Motec, we try to leave everything as stock as we can. Even the accessory drive and the LSs use the original power steering lines, AC lines. We have bolt-in mounts. The mounts on this vehicle look like a direct copy of ours, so I'm sure they were hijacked from us, but we've been dealing with that for over a decade. Our LS stuff was hijacked 10 years ago. The accessory drive on this is a little bit different. It's basically a stock accessory drive, but they put the power steering pump over on the left side, which is fine. I mean, we've done that also, but then you're dealing with custom power steering lines rather than the stock ones that we use, and they're relatively short because the power steering pump sits just above the steering gear. This vehicle does have 3-link suspension, which this one's working pretty good. I'm not a big fan of the 3-link suspensions on the road. I know they're great off-road, but this one's working pretty good. They set it up well. In fact, the entire Jeep is completely pimped out. It's got a ton of stuff. It had dual batteries, and you can see all the lights and other things that it has, but it's been built very well. So the customer wanted a well-built powertrain. There's really nothing wrong with the powertrain that was in the vehicle other than it was misconfigured. It was the execution of the conversion. While we could go into the nitty-gritty of how to interface the JK to the GM powertrain, and for that matter even a Hemi, because you know guys have a problem with the Hemi conversions too. But let's just say that this conversion was not interfaced properly. So while the engine would run, it ran poorly. The engine sometimes would not start. It was not pleasant in the cab because of the gases and noise that were coming through the firewall. Basically, the customer had spent a lot of money and he wanted a conversion that not only was reliable, but ran good and you could enjoy. Because I'll be honest, when I drive a V6 JK and I'm on the highway 75, 80 miles an hour, I really don't like it. The revving up, the constant downshifting and all that gets tiresome after a while. So he wanted a Jeep that he could cruise down the highway, and I do believe this is a California Jeep, so he got a lot of grades around him. He wanted a Jeep that had enough power that could get the job done in the highway, and I do think this is an off-road shop that owns this Jeep, so they probably want to show it off to the customers. Now I don't want to drag this video out too long, but I do want to say that the way Motec does things versus the way others do things is different, and it's been different since the very beginning, and there's several reasons why. Our mission goal from the beginning was to keep these Jeeps legal. In order to keep these Jeeps legal, we have to go with a complete OEM US EPA certified powertrain. So that's what we do. We leave the GM side completely alone and we interface it to the Chrysler side just to get the functionality we need. And that's where all the magic happens. As far as the mechanical side of installing an LS, it's easy. Or an LT. It's actually easier than a Hemi because they're smaller, they're lighter, they cool better, they lay out awesome. The hard part is making it talk to the Jeep. And it's the same thing with a Hemi. With a Hemi, if you import all the V8 stuff into the V6 operating system, you're basically patching it. Up until the JL, there wasn't a factory Hemi put in a Wrangler. Now, the factory did explore the Hemi and the JK, but they never offered it to the public for safety reasons and cooling system issues and whatnot. Putting the GM powertrain in at the beginning was pretty complex, but now we've pretty much distilled it down to the same technology that the OE manufacturers use, and that is just another CAN module. Because there's dozens and dozens of CAN modules in your vehicle. Some vehicles have CAN modules for the power seats, or for the door locks, or for the lights. So adding one small CAN bridge to the network is really a drop in the bucket. And what it comes down to is coding. Identifying what needs to be done and then getting it done. And I think that the module they had in this Jeep was just immature. It did not have the ability to do a lot of the functions that were required to get the Jeep functional. But this is common. We see this all the time. When guys try to put their own powertrains in their Jeeps and their JKs. Now remember, I started off doing swaps in the late 1970s when you had like 5 wires to interface into the vehicle. Today, it's a whole different world. And guys think, oh, if I get an LS into my JK, everything's just going to work. And the sad reality is it doesn't. So if we go beyond the actual installation into the JK and making the powertrain talk to the vehicle, this vehicle had very basic issues. Holes in the exhaust system, holes in the firewall, an engine configuration that was not right. Now, that's easy to do. Almost every week I get a guy call me and say, hey, I got a 2008 transmission for out of a Denali. I got a good deal on it, and I bought a 14 engine. So there's going to be a problem there. Can we deal with it? Yes, because we have experience and we know how to upgrade and change things and all that. A good rule of thumb is get the entire powertrain out of a single vehicle, or out of the same year vehicle at least. So if you were going to buy a 16 LT 5.3, get a 16 LT transmission. In late 2016, early 2017, GM did change the transmission control module from a T87 to a T87A. Then in about 19, they stepped it up even further. They went to a newer style transmission and controller. A lot of that was based on the 10-speed. Then when they went to the Type 2 10-speed, they changed things up even again. So you can't just mix and match and buy a 2021 10-speed and a 2014 engine. Yeah, physically, they will bolt up to each other, but they're just not going to work right. How did we learn? The school of hard knocks. We would buy these things, we would experiment with these things. Just like the LS, we had to blaze a trail. We had to see what worked and what didn't. But where we are different than most of the industry is we try to stay with a US EPA approved powertrain. And that doesn't just mean the engine and the transmission, but that means the engine harness, the operating systems, the modules, the calibrations, and that's what allows us to go to California with our executive order, because those components have already been tested together and been certified. So all we have to do is duplicate it. We're not doing a hybrid where we're putting a 5-speed or an 8-speed behind an LS engine. We're not hacking and patching the operating system, making a 6-cylinder operating system think it's a 8-cylinder. And don't get me wrong, a lot of those setups can be excellent. They can run excellent and they can be reliable, but it's just different than being completely OE. Some of the advantages of being completely OE are not only emissions, but diagnostics and troubleshooting. If you were to take any of our LT, in fact, we changed all the wiring out on this vehicle because we don't use aftermarket harnesses, or at least not very often. We find the OE harnesses are built to a higher standard, they're tested to a higher standard, they use heavier gauge wire, they have power and ground distribution that's proper for the powertrain. They have failure modes. Some of these harnesses only have 1, 2, 3 fuses in the entire powertrain. You blow a fuse, you're dead in the water. I think we're running about 10, 12, 13 depending on the vehicle, and we have circuit protection for coils and injectors and O2 sensors. I had a guy up in I think he was up by Moab, or in northern Utah somewhere. His O2 wire had shorted out up against the exhaust and it blew a fuse. Now it did run kind of crappy and the check engine light came on, but the guy was still on the road. The moral of the story is we've had Jeeps with aftermarket harnesses with, let's say, 2 or 3 fuses where all the injectors and coils are ganged together, and you blow one coil and you're dead in the water. That vehicle's not going to run. And not only that, when it comes to circuit protection, you have to have proper current flow. We had one recently where they had ganged so much stuff onto one fuse that it was overloading the circuit. It was running really, really hot. And then the powertrain relay, which powered a bunch of other stuff, was melting. I was driving the vehicle and I had to get out and jump the relay to get back to the shop. So staying with an OE harness, you know that it's been engineered properly, you know that it's been built properly, you know that it's been tested properly. Then you combine that with OE modules that are US EPA certified, and you should expect OE type performance and OE type reliability. Had a couple of calls this week with guys that are doing LT builds, and they asked my opinion on headers and deleting the catalytic converters. 2 guys were going to put cams in, stage 1 cams, so I'm just going to mention that briefly. Headers can buy you some horsepower, but they can also be a pain. Our experience shows that shorty headers don't do a whole lot. I've been using shorty headers since the 1980s. They make a little bit more noise, they put out more heat in the engine compartment, and they're more likely to leak than a cast manifold, or let's say an OE manifold like the LT1, which are beautiful stainless manifolds. Mid-tube headers can probably buy you a little bit, and long tube headers can definitely buy you something. I used to build tri-Y headers. I worked with Doug Thorley, and I also used to build 180-degree headers, and that's a whole subject on its own. But it did require on a small block 4 of the pipes to cross over sides. It was really a pain, but I did it in Corvettes and some Camaros, and they sounded like Ferraris because you were evening out the exhaust pulses. Plus, you could use a smaller tube and get better exhaust flow because of the even exhaust pulses. If you're going to go with a long tube header, and there's some out there, expect issues. First, you're going to have fitment issues. We did some long tube headers in a 2-door, and we had to relocate the fuel tank, and it had interference on the Atlas and frame, and just expect that. If you bolt it in and everything is perfect, you just got lucky. 2, expect more noise and expect more heat. We do like to wrap our headers. We want to keep that heat out of the engine compartment. The JK engine compartment is small and it's under a higher pressure than the atmosphere outside. So the fan's trying to pull through the AC condenser, the transmission cooler, the radiator, the grill. You want to keep as much heat out of that engine compartment as possible, so wrapping the headers keeps the heat into the exhaust. Now some of you are going to say, oh, well, that might lead to corrosion in the headers or whatever, but you can pick and choose your fight. In order to take full advantage of headers, everything else has to go along with it. So one, the tune's going to have to be changed, maybe some more fuel, maybe some more spark if you have a freer flowing exhaust. But then you're also going to have to change the intake. Now our intake is pretty free flowing, so you're probably not going to have to do a whole lot with that. But you're probably going to want to get some colder air to it, and you're definitely going to have to tweak that tune. What are you going to pick up? Who knows, 10, 20, 30, 40 horsepower. Now, I do recommend the Stage 1 cam because, especially with the LTs, and, you know, to a certain extent, the 6L80. The 6L80 is a clutch-to-clutch transmission, so the converters are a lot more sophisticated than the earlier 350s and 4L60s and 75s and 80s, but they pretty much got the converters down for the 6L80 now. They used to be really, really expensive, but now you can pick them up for under $1,000. So you need to raise the stall of your converter. What does that mean? That's basically the slippage at a stop. Because when you put a big cam in, we're dwelling on a stage 1 cam right now. If we go with a stage 1 cam, you're probably not going to have to change your converter, and you're probably not going to have to change your tune too much. Companies like Brian Tooley, Texas Speed, Comp Cams, Crane, they kind of design these things, and they'll tell you, hey, you're going to have to modify this or you're not. And some of them, even like Edelbrock, will offer a tune to you for the application. But you're not going to have to do a whole lot of mechanical changes, meaning you're probably not going to have to replace the converter. The idle's probably not going to be at 900 RPM or like the 600 and something horsepower LS we have in the shop, 1100 RPM, rump, rump, rump. So if you stay with the stage 1 cam, you let the thing breathe, you get some headers on there, you're going to pick up some horsepower. And there's a caveat to that I'll talk about in a second, because that's what I've been doing for the last 40 years, is trying to get performance out of engines. And for the majority of that time, it was larger displacement engines, camshafts, and all the old hot rodder tricks. So if you do go to a stage 2 cam, and we've had some pretty radical cams. I had a guy with an L86 put a stage 2 or 3 cam in, but it was radical. It had to idle at 1,000 RPM, rump, rump, rump. He at first did not change the converter, then he went to a billet converter, and that was like, I don't know, $1,500 or $2,000. And then he had to have a lot of dyno tuning done. And at the end of the day, it had a lot of horsepower, I'll give him that, but it mostly shifted the horsepower range up on the LT, because remember, and this is what I tried to explain to a guy just a few days ago, he wanted a lot of bottom end torque. He's towing a trailer. He wants more power. So he's thinking, I'll put a cam in an LT. Well, the LT, L86 and LT1 6.2s have tremendous bottom end torque. They're 300 and something foot-pounds of torque under 2,000 RPM, if I remember correctly. And the torque curve is flat as a dinner plate. It goes straight up off idle and then goes right across. So you're halfway to a diesel. That's what the LT does. It has tremendous torque on the bottom. You got 11.5 to 1 compression ratio. You have a continuous variable valve timing camshaft that will phase that cam and get you maximum torque on the bottom end. You got direct injection for more combustion, cylinder efficiency. We ran some early L86s against LS3s and 6.4 Hemis. In every situation, they would outrun them off the line. So you get a car length, 2 car lengths off the line, and then it was just catch up for the other engine. Because the other engine has more horsepower, it just doesn't have as much torque. Remember, an old NASCAR guy told me that torque gets you there and horsepower keeps you there. So that's how you got to think of an LT. It is an engine that has tremendous torque at low RPM. And when you combine that with a 10-speed transmission or even an 8 like I'm driving right now, it just gives you awesome throttle response and tremendous torque to pull trailers and go up grades. Now, by camming that engine, especially with a big cam, you're starting to lose that bottom end torque. In addition to losing that bottom end torque and shifting that RPM band up, you're restricting the VVT or the CVVT. So now the cam doesn't have the range to move in order to get maximum benefit from variable valve timing. Most of the cam manufacturers put a block or a limiter on the camshaft, so it can only phase so much, or they eliminate it altogether. And now you're losing that benefit of VVT. You don't want valve to piston interference, so if you phase that camshaft too much with a high lift cam, there is a possibility of piston to valve interference and you're screwed. So I know there's a lot to absorb here and I'm a little bit off topic, but I hope I'm making the point about keeping the powertrain as stock as you can to get OE reliability, good fuel economy. I just went to Park City with an LS. I think I had 35s. You'll see the video here soon. It might have been 37s, but I drove it at a constant 80 miles an hour, and it surprised me that I got almost 17 miles to the gallon in that Jeep, because we had high winds and I wasn't running the best gas. So these things can get pretty decent economy. Once you start pimping out the tune and putting PE in and all that other stuff, you're probably going to lose economy. Remember, these tunes are maximized for all situations. If you were in one environment all the time, like let's say it was hot out, or it was below freezing out, you could probably make some gains with a tune. But when you want your Jeep to run in 100-degree temperatures and in sub-zero temperatures, then the tune's just going to have to be a compromise, and the manufacturers know the best compromise. So on that thread, let me finish one more thought, and that is, buy the horsepower you want. don't get a 5.3 and cam it and then get 6.0 horsepower. Don't buy a 6.0 and cam it and get 6.2 horsepower, because what you're losing is drivability. If you got a larger displacement engine, they can be more efficient under high load situations. They can get better economy if you're towing or going up a grade with a heavy JK, rather than a small engine working hard. Most guys get better economy with our engines than they do with the OE engines. So you buy a 5.3, you spend several $1,000s camming it, putting headers on it and everything else. Now you got a rump engine, and you spent more money than if you had just bought a 6.0, which probably has similar horsepower. In fact, I just did a video on one of those from a guy in Arizona. I don't know if I published it yet. He had a shop guaranteeing he'd get 400 horsepower, and he had 400 horsepower with a 6-liter, but it was so rump and radical, and his eyes were watering in his garage that his wife wouldn't drive the vehicle. He sent it to us. We put an LS3 in stock. He loves it. He's still driving it today, and I think it's been about 10 years. And his wife will drive it to the store, and they have similar power to what they had before, about 440 horsepower. Caveat emptor, buyer beware. Do your diligence. Now, there's a lot of good companies out there doing engine conversions, and they're not just LS and LTs. There's also the Hemi, which is the most popular engine conversion of the JK for obvious reasons. Now, I do prefer some of the characteristics of the LS, and I definitely prefer the characteristics of the LT. I drive the Hemis, and they are a great upgrade, but I do think that the LT and the LS does have advantages. Now, be careful. If you have a shop that's an upstart, or they're going to offer you something strange, like, you know, a Volkswagen diesel, or maybe a Duramax, or a Cummins 4BT. Now, I'm not saying some of those don't work or won't work, but they're not mainstream. They're not the most supported swaps out there. And I get a tremendous amount of calls that guys call me. Hey, I had a Cummins put in my Jeep, and the air conditioning doesn't work right, and I was told that the cruise control won't work, and all this stuff. You know, in our conversion and most of the Hemi conversions, things like remote start, heated seats. Yeah, believe it or not, your heated seats in your 110 AC outlet adapter, if you have it on your JK, won't work if you have certain codes or it's not supported right. And we have spent years getting the coding into our module and refining it, and we're going to continue to do that. And in some cases, we're actually exceeding the OE functionality, like getting current gear on the dash of the earlier JKs, or tap shift in cruise, where you can have manual shifting in a JK and even do it within cruise control. We can take a manual transmission JK and light the dash up so it's just like an automatic. So we've actually added some functionality to some of our conversions. What you want to know if you go to a shop that's an upstart or is buying a kit from somebody or experimenting with your Jeep, what are you going to get at the end of the day? Are you going to get a product that you're happy with and that they're going to back up? And I don't say this lightly, because we do get a lot of guys calling us to have their Jeeps reworked. In fact, right after this one came in, another one came in. And I don't like to see them for two reasons. One, that customer had to go through grief with another shop, so he's already upset. Two, it's just something we don't really like to do, meaning if we get a stock JK, my guys pull the body off, we drop the motor in, we plug everything in, we put the body back on, we do some programming, and the thing is on the road. You get something like this, you pull the body off, and it's Frankenstein's monster. We got to weld up the firewall, we've got to fix the exhaust system, we got to replace engine harnesses, we got to buy computers. We did have to buy a computer for this one, I think, and when you do that, it's a process. First you got to buy the computer, then you got to hook up Y-Tech, which isn't cheap. It's about 200 bucks these days to flash one of these things. So we have to hook up Y-Tech and flash the computer, then we have to do a vehicle configuration, then we have to restore the SCIM code. So all those extra steps, we're going backwards and then coming back forwards again. It's like 3 steps back, 2 steps forward with these builds. So we're going to take this Jeep up to the mountain, and I must say it runs excellent. I'm really happy with the way it runs, but nothing is easy and there is no free lunch. We really had to change almost everything on this Jeep to get it to this point. We had to change the modules in the GM side. We had to add modules on the Chrysler side. We had to do programming. We had to do mechanical repairs. We had to do just all sorts of stuff to get this thing back where it needed to be. I just had a guy text me yesterday, and he only has a 6-liter LS, and he lives in Texas. He's been driving his Jeep for just about a year now, I guess, and he just out of the blue wrote me, how happy he was with his LSJK. He said him and his wife drive all over the place, and having the V8 in it has made it a whole different experience for them, because they do a lot of traveling and not so much expedition, but they got a heavy JK and they tow a trailer. So the 6-liter really transformed it into something they can enjoy. So when a customer tells me that, I am happy for them. And even if they had that conversion done somewhere else, I would still be happy for them. But I'm not happy when I get a call from a Jeeper and he had a conversion done somewhere, whether it's us or anybody else, and he's having all these issues and problems, because it just makes the whole market look bad at the end of the day. And this is a huge market. You know, there's well over 1 million JKs out there, and the JLJTs are on their way. So there's going to be every fly-by-night shop out there doing these conversions, whether they make it up themselves, they buy a kit from somebody, or they develop their own swap. Your job is to do your diligence and get a track record on that company before you drop that money. And unfortunately, we were out 4, 5, 6 months on bills, and I think we're still out 2 or 3 months right now. So guys call us and say, we want you to do the build, and we say we can't do it for 3 months, and they're not happy about that. So they go to some other shop, and that's where a lot of this stuff starts. So we're at the trail now. We will see you soon. We got a lot of cool stuff coming up.